Hey everyone, this is Will. Welcome to Black in the Core. On this channel, we cover the best of Black life and culture in New York City.
Welcome. My name is Erica Harper. I'm the Vice President of Learning and Engagement here at Weeksville. A pleasure to have you all here with us this evening for what I am sure is about to be a really marvelous conversation with author and historian Blair Kelley. Welcome, Blair.
Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Thanks for being here. I'm so excited to have you.
We've been planning this for like 18
I know.
years.
It feels like forever. I'm going to jump in real quick and do my Weeksville thing. So, give me a hand if this is your first time here at Weeksville. Yes, I love it. Welcome. I hope you feel at home here. I hope you come back here. So really briefly, even though I am the VP of Learning and Engagement, I'm not here to do my whole spiel, but I got to tell you a little bit about where you are, because I think it's really important for the conversation that we're going to have this evening. There were so many moments I was reading, I was like, it sounds like Weeksville, it sounds like people in Weeksville. So I'm excited to get into it. Weeksville was one of the first recognized free Black communities in the country. I have taken to making sure I include that word recognize when I start this spiel, right? Because we know, Black folks know that we have been here existing, surviving, thriving, whether we have been recognized or not. So yes, we have the Weeksville that still have physical remnants of the people that lived here, our historic houses that are here on the grounds, but I was going to say we New Yorkers, but I'm not a New Yorker, I'm a Southerner. I've been here for a year, so I live here now, but you New Yorkers. Also, probably know the stories of places like Seneca Village, right, that is now Central Park, and countless other sort of free Black communities and Black folks who have existed, and we will never know their names.
I don't think I ever would have written this book if I had not been asked the question, what is the Black working class? My editor had read a lot about the white working class, and he was wondering, who's going to write the book about the Black working class? Many of the stories that I include in the book are family stories that my mother, my grandfather, my father, my grandmother told me really regularly, and also a few things that I just gleaned from my early childhood in the conclusion. So it's not a memoir, it's not about me, but I was prepared, I think, in a way, by my folks to tell this story all my life. And I think, as a person who grew up in South Jersey, they wanted me to know where we came from. They wanted me to not be disconnected from the communities that they grew up in. They wanted all of those things to be recognizable and resonant for me. And so I think they were preparing me all along for this bigger story. And the whole crew of ancestors had things that they wanted to add and say along the journey. So I'm very thankful to be able to follow this trail and to be given the space to say what I wanted to say and what they wanted to say about the story.
So we're on 49, and we're talking about Henry, a blacksmith. Oh, this is so good. Let's see, I'm going to try not to read too much. Okay, I'm going to give you a little paragraph. So during the 43 years he lived as a slave, the law had systematically blocked him from accessing a formal education. So when he leaned over the table, he did not know how to write his own name. Instead, he marked a confident X on the middle of the line, certifying that he was a citizen of the state of Georgia and a resident of Elbert County, the place where he had been born a slave and where he would now be a voter. Even without formal education, he knew that citizenship should mean that he would have a say in what his country would be from that moment forward. Signing that registration book on July 19, 1867, the registrar wrote above the X the phrase, his mark. Indeed, even in the face of violence, Henry and his family faced on every side from those angry about the idea of Black freedom and citizenship, Henry made his mark. That day, his X provided rich testimony to his belief in his equality as a man, and his assertion that he should be a citizen. This registration is the only document I have found that was marked by his hand. I had to pause for a second. What was that moment like?
That was like the middle of the night when I found him on that registration book, and I was like, that's it right there. Between that, finding him, I found him two places that where I was like, okay, I found him there registering to vote, but the one that really kicked me in the gut was finding him in the will of his master, his slaveholder. And, my good training as a historian says to me that someone that holds 200 some people in bondage doesn't list enslaved people by name in their will, right? They don't. They do them in sort of lots, right? And so I was like, I'm not gonna waste my time reading a handwritten will that's like this long, and I'm not gonna do that. And then something said to me, read. And I was like, are you sure? I was like, okay, I'm supposed to read, and it was like, read. And it was like 2 a.m, and I just sat there and I read, and it's tedious because you're reading, like, you have to create a code basically to decipher the handwriting because it's kind of loopy and weird and old-fashioned. And I'm reading, and I see a big old looping H. And I'm like, oh, does that say Henry? And I was like, oh wow, it does. And there he was in the will, and it said a blacksmith, which I did not know until I saw that. And it's probably why he was listed there. But then I thought, oh wow, where's the rest of his family? He had a wife and several children at that point, and they are not listed. And so I wondered if his slaveholder had passed away before the Civil War, which he didn't. He died in the Civil War. Would he have been given without his family? And so I really started to think about what the consequences could have been for my family and for my future. So.
And then that part in the book too, you talk about Henry, right? The chapter is Henry, a blacksmith, and the reason that you think that he was listed in that will spoke to the skill, right, that he had as a blacksmith. So worthy of having a name because the skills that he brought, right, his property was super valuable for because was he willed to his son?
He was willed to his son.
Willed to his son. So, sort of passing Henry on for his skills. So Henry leads us to, you tell us a little bit about Solicitor Duncan?
So Solicitor is my great-grandfather. It's a story I used to start the entire book.
So good.
And it is, it's sort of like my family origin story.
Mm-hmm.
It's a story my mother told me, strong 100 times. Like as I grew up, my grandmother told me the story, my grandfather told me, so they all told some version of this story of my great-grandfather, Solicitor. He was a sharecropper. He was really smart, really skilled. And he was trying to, get ahead of the sharecropping system, and he kept, not making much money. And then one year, the man told him that he owed them money at the end because he had bought some provisions in the store and they charged exorbitant interest on them. And so he was like, well, we gotta run. And so they ran in the middle of the night. And so I remember my mother being like, they ran like slaves. They weren't slaves, but they ran like slaves. And then she wanted me to know that they had done nothing wrong, that it was really the injustice that they were facing that meant that they had to run. And they ended up evacuating, and they all end up in a place called Thomasville, North Carolina. And that's where my mother was born, and where my students from. And so it's, that sort of origin story is so important for my family, and it was important for my mother for me to understand that leaving the South wasn't necessarily choice. There was force, there was violence, there was threat, there was injustice, but that they were skilled and talented and brilliant. It wasn't a failure on our part.
Thank you for that. And then John D.
John D is my grandfather. So he's born in Georgia. Researching the Solicitor story was really interesting to me because all I ever had was Georgia. Like that was just a blank slate. And so I found out so much about where they were from in Georgia in researching the book. And so my grandfather, John D, was always a character. I don't even put all of how he was a character in the book because it would be too much. But he and his brother O.B. Were teenagers, and they came to Thomasville looking to work in the factories there. They were both really talented carpenters, woodworkers. My great uncle Obi was a great mason too. So they thought they could find top jobs, and they could only find janitors jobs in the factories, the furniture factories there in Thomasville. And so they kept migrating and kept going. And so he's really a driving story for me. And the injustices he faced as he migrated, he really, becomes an example of the ways in which skilled black men cannot find space to do the work that they want to do. And that skill becomes the domain of white men over time, both in the South and the North.
There's a, I'm not going to flip for it now, but there's a line almost specifically that to the book. Well, I'll read it because I wrote it down about the washerwomen who I want to make sure. So I probably spend most of the time talking about the washerwomen because I learned so much. But there was something that you said about the washerwomen, and it says, as enslaved women, that skill made them valuable on the auction block, but as free women, it was systematically discounted. And so thinking about all of these roles, right? And I know I'm jumping right in, y'all, but, so Blair talks about Henry, a blacksmith. She talks about maids. She talks about the woman porters. She talks about the washerwomen. And so thinking about the skills, all of that being highly skilled labor. I mean, there was one, I was just cracking up. I read a line, it was like, the white folks are threatening to open up their own laundromats and things like that. We're gonna do it ourselves because black folks feeling themselves too much. And it was like, and it never happened. They never got along to it, right? Realizing the actual skill and effort, those, what you think are menial and simple jobs, but just like how hard it is to get the whites white, right? And how no single mark on there, or else you might even face death. It's sort of the price of stepping across the line in those times, like literally was death, right? That was on the table. And what they were able to do with that anyway. But just this thought that working class is work that they were doing, unskilled labor, they were lazy, all these stereotypes that come out. And I think what I got a lot out of your book was recognizing sort of the source of those stereotypes, right? Not that I didn't already know them, but it really was white fear of being outmanned, outmatched, because they were, right? We have been doing that work forever. We knew how to do it like the back of our hands, but because, it was black, it was brown, they decided to broad brush it, and it's like, oh, well, it's unskilled work. It's like, all right, you come here and do all this laundry. I'm trying to save the washerwomen for towards the end because I want to talk about it so much. Before I get to the washerwomen, can you talk a little bit about the black church in the book? And I mean, really just its role as a subversive space. And I think, just talk about that.
So I talk about faith as a contested space. So often, we're told that black Christianity is, compliance. And it's the failure to resist. But black Christianity grows up in opposition. It's a counter reading. And it's a way to sort of say, enslavement and the logics behind it are corrupt, and that the real people who should be heralded and held up are the enslaved, that they're held up in the Bible, right? And so it's hilarious that people are trying to oppress folks with a document that centers enslaved people. It tickles me.
How does this work?
And so, when black people discover the lie, they dive in with their own reading of the text and their own way of pushing back. And so black churches in slavery are spaces of resistance, of support, of community, of developing that independent sense of self, and that joy and that not breaking to the overwhelming kind of submission that the slaveholders want from them. And then in freedom, it becomes this counter space. It becomes our first black institution, and spaces where people can speak honestly about what's happening to them, what they're worried about, how they can craft strategies to resist and to survive. And so I wanted to talk, if you write a labor book, you generally don't write about a church. But for me, if you want to know the ethic of where a black working class comes from, in part, it's grounded in the institution the first independent Black institution in our history.
Were there any stories, and I'm sure there were a lot of them, right? Because so much of it is your family. Were there any stories that stuck with you? Were there any that went through your head when you were trying to go to sleep at night? You're trying to figure out how to tell the story.
I don't know. When you're writing, everything works. You're trying to figure out how to say it, and try to let those sentences get loose in the loopy hours of the night. For me, I wrote the whole thing after midnight. There's no word that was written fresh. Okay, but I think I was really struck with Minnie. The woman I traced from Acclaimed County who migrates to Philadelphia. She basically runs away to migrate. I loved her story and her oral history and her feistiness that really popped through that oral history, and I wanted to try and capture that how determined she was, how she had a vision of what could be different, and how disappointed she was when she got there. And for me, it captures so much of Black women's experiences with migration, and in that first generation really struggling to find a just way forward for them, and the ways in which we don't center them when we talk about labor. Washington women were this sort of crazy stereotypes space for white observers, but also the ways in which Black women empower themselves and their families doing this work in their own homes. They were the first work from home generation, and that their habits of work, their resistance, their raising their own children in their own yards, in their own homes, was a set of gains and wins in a labor fight that happens right at the end of the Civil War. Invisible to Hornsby were the skills that Sarah possessed.
That's the line I was looking for.
Sarah knew how to put the wind to work, how to make soap rise from ashes and grease, how to make industrial refuse into washpots and fire, how to take hold of hot iron to smooth and not to burn, how to make the white people's filthy things bright and white like new. This knowledge wasn't innate. These skills were her inheritance from her sisters, both in blood and community, passed down from woman to woman, working shoulder to shoulder in concert with one another. Taking in laundry gave Sarah the power to choose who she worked for and when, and the pace of her labor was set by no man. Her time was set by her own hand. This work that her ancestors first learned in slavery but then later used to establish their own households after emancipation formed the foundation of her freedom.
Do you want to tell briefly just about the Pullman Porters or the Maids, any other stories?
So I read about the Pullman Porters, which is, I think, a more known labor story, but I tried to do it again from that very personal point of view. I found some beautiful oral histories from the Pullman Porters to talk about the experience of putting up with being a Pullman Porter, and then the experience of organizing in spite of dramatic and heavy surveillance that they experienced, and really amazing stories from men and women about their experiences working for the Pullman Company and then building this union. And for me, thinking about their union is a reminder that when Black people unionize, it isn't just for themselves. That they're not unionizing just to get a better salary and better benefits. The Pullman Porters turn that union on its head immediately and demand things for other workers. They demand things of the federal government. They become a tool of the civil rights movement. And so it's a reminder that when we lose unions, when we're attacking unions, we're not just attacking those individual workers, we're attacking organizing principles being shared and built out for all Americans. And so when Black workers have that collective power, they do so much. So I was excited to write about them. My mother always talked about Pullman Porters, and that was a good job. Elevator operator, that was a good job. And so she had a whole list, and then postal workers, of course, but she also always said it was a really great job. And so I closed the book in terms of employments. with postal workers because they are so embattled right now. And I wanted people to understand that Black people being in the post office was a victory, that we were forbidden by law from being hired as postal workers in first generations. It's the only working class job delineated in the American Constitution. And so it's fundamental to the question of citizenship. And so Black people fighting for access to postal jobs is citizenship work and freedom work in really key ways.
And I think for me, I think, and maybe I should say shamefully, right? When I think of union, it's not Black folks that I think about. And I'm reading this book and I'm like, how not, right? The heart of organizing and coming together as community to serve ourselves, serve generations that come after me is like so deeply rooted in the Black experience, like from the times of enslavement on. And so so now I'm thinking about, how it was such a big deal that there was a Black man that was the face of the Amazon Union, that back when Twitter was Twitter, right? It's kind of like, Black folks, and it's like, oh, that's interesting, like, yes, and they're getting the things done, but because it's been taught to us that way, right? It's been given to us that way, right? The face of unions, the face of workers are always white folks, white men especially.
And oftentimes, there's the assumption that Black workers need consciousness raising. They need someone from the outside to come tell them the circumstances that are terrible that they're facing and be taught like how to do this and how to do that. Black workers don't need that. They understand where they are. They've always understood. What was striking to me, I have a group of washerwomen in Jackson, Mississippi, who organized in 1865 to build a union. So they had been enslaved, and they understood where they stood in the world, how to build a collective monopoly that they had on a particular piece of employment, and to make demands. So nobody needed to raise their consciousness. They didn't need Marxism. They didn't need, training. They understood just as much as Marx ever did about working class needs, right? And so oftentimes Black workers need financial support and resources and folks who are outside of their employments who won't get fired to build out support, but they don't need to be told how to think about these things. And so that was something that had always stuck with me as an irritation when I was reading other things and that I wanted to speak back into in terms of what I found when I was working on this book.
So I guess I'll leave some time for y'all to have some questions, because I know a couple faces in this crowd, so I know y'all have some questions, but y'all know I'm an educator, so I gotta do a thing first. Before we get to y'all's questions, there's another part that I loved in Blair's book, so this is a little participation activity. So there is 14, we're on page 14. Blair is describing her Black folk, right? So she's talking about what her Black folk is. So the question, I'm gonna read you Blair, because the question is, what's your Black folk, all right? So Blair says, my Black folk, well, you read it.
Okay. My invocation of Black folk is the feel of fuzzy string beans in my hand, as my grandmother recalled how she learned to pick them without hurting the plants themselves back in Newberry, South Carolina. I learned the folk in the rhythm of the chatter of women gathered in the churchyard for what felt like hours. My grandmother and her deaconess, all white, sharing laughs and raised eyebrow looks under the brim of her hat, as well as insights and ideas under the shade of the big oak tree. My Black folk is the smell of roasted salt pork stewing in the pot liquor of my grandmother's turnip greens, as I nestled against her round hip as she stood on line to serve mourners in the church basement during the repast. Her lessons of independence, community, wisdom, and service are how I first came to know myself. Black folk is what my community calls itself. The joy in our connection, our coming together, my people.
I could really just sit here and just read passages out loud.
And that whole passage comes because my editor, who is not Black, said to me, well, are you going to address the elephant in the room of how you chose the title Black folk? And I was like, what elephant is that? And he's like, well, because you named the whole book after Du Bois and the souls of Black folk. And, this is really, I'm like, ooh. No, I didn't. So I went on Twitter and I asked people, so when I say Black folk, what do you think of? And all the Black people were like, grandmother in pantyhose and slips and Sunday morning, greens and the white people were like, W.E.B. Du Bois. And it was important text. And so I was like, okay, so I do have to address that.
And I think, this feels like a love letter to regular Black folks too, in so many ways. And I think what you talk about that, right? Sort of why it's not souls of Black folks, why we're not talking about the talented 10th and the two-ness, right? Because regular Black folks didn't even get to experiencing that. And I forget the numbers, but it was something like, some 80+% of Black folks were working class. There's so much scholarship, talks, history on the Harlem Renaissance, on the talented 10th, right? No shade, we need all of this, right? Like, this is not a monolith. But so much attention has been given to that, and then you realize, like, literally it was a talented 10th. It was a 10th of the folks, and like, what if all those other folks experience that we don't talk about, that we lump together under whatever umbrella and give so much of that? So like, this and like your insistence on naming folks, really doing the research to find who they are. And you say that, like, I want to give name to the nameless, and I think you do such a beautiful job of, it just felt like a love letter to these folks, and I just like, I had to take a moment and like, be grateful for my people to even be able. I got a lot of inspiration from it, a lot of thinking about how I want to be showing up in the world, and thinking about what stories I need to be getting from my folks while they're still here, right? While regular Black folks still around. So I'm gonna give y'all some time, but you gotta answer my question first. So, what's your Black folks in the room? Who want to start?
First of all, I guess I'll say my Black folks are from Mississippi. Mississippi, if anybody knows it, BB King from there. And then my other side is from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And so it's a really rich history. And then my mother ended up remarrying someone from Tifton, Georgia. And then we lived in North Carolina for a while, but I was born in Chicago. So it was always, and then my grandmother, who I spent my childhood with, had greens and tomatoes and all that in her backyard. So in a similar way, when I think of my folks, I think of food, but I also think of transition, right? Because even though I was raised in Chicago / between the South, I then moved to New York, and that ended up in Bed-Stuy. And then I ended up next to someone who moved to Bed-Stuy when she was in her 20s and she was 80 at the time. And so I think about how I am a continuation of my folks, and then also finding out they were artists and musicians. And my granny didn't necessarily go out, and she was able to find work as an assistant, but she played piano and all these other things. So I think of very nomadic musical people. My question for you actually is in the realm of that, the kind of regular Black folks conversations, almost the resistance people have to it, and also the resistance people have to Black, like trauma porn, right? Did you consider that at all when writing a book on the Black working class, how it may be received as something that's a part of the downtrodden history of Black people, and how did you overcome that in your writing?
Yeah, one thing that was important for me to emphasize is that, there's only like half a chapter on slavery, because I think so many people are like, oh Lord, it was slavery, tired of seeing about slavery. And the funniest thing is, one of my biggest national interviews, she asked me, I don't know, like 10 questions about slavery, and I was like, hey, this is not a slavery book. Let's move on. It came out okay, but came out beautiful. I appreciate being there. I think so much of how we feel is this exhaustion with the hard stuff. And so for me, Black folk is the reminder that there's the hard stuff, but it's not who we are. And who we are is something different and distinct. And it is joyful, it is internal, it is something that the world doesn't know, it's a secret. And so I wanted to speak to some of what that was in a way that felt resonant, that felt like when people could see their own grandparents and they could see their own folks and they could have better understanding about the things that they grew up around. One man told me at one of my talks, he said, my grandmother was a washerwoman. And he's like, and now I know she was doing that so she could be with me, so she could raise me. He's like, I didn't know that. I didn't, So I wanted people to see the resistance and the skill and the brilliance of the things that they have been around all their lives.
I have a channel called Black in the Core. It's about centering Black life and culture in New York City. One of the questions I had for you, I was wondering if you would like to share any thoughts on gentrification and the effect that it's having on the Black working class communities, class communities in cities like New York.
Yeah, so when I pitched the book, it had a chapter, it had like a bunch of chapters that I didn't write. And I got to a certain point, I was like, ooh, this book is huge. Like, people aren't gonna read it if it's like twice the size. So I may write another book, but gentrification for me is such an interesting topic, in part because we don't think of space and place and land as something that can hold such meaning. But I've been teaching Hurricane Katrina for a really long time. When it was happening when I was a young professor, and I wanted to bring it to the classroom. I was a historian of New Orleans in my first book, and I saw so much that was being lost that people thought of as not having meaning, of the working class who were being, left behind in the city and abandoned in the city to support it. The reason they were there was to support the city, and then the storm was beyond what people expected. But they weren't there because they were stupid. They weren't there because they didn't respect nature or whatever. They were there because they were at work. And when they lost what they had, oftentimes they may not have owned their homes, or they may have been long-term renters, or their homes were seen as less valuable, their communities as less valuable. And so for me, that sort of rapid turnover of a gentrification, of a devaluing of Black space, and the meaning of Black space was what's happening in so many cities in ways that we cannot delineate because there is no storm. But that same kinds of process are happening for our cities where spaces, are taking over, and people are saying that it has no meaning because it's Black. An erasure of the ways in which Black people have not been able to get loans to do things to improve their communities, to where they may have been renters and people are like, oh, that's a bad looking neighborhood, and that could be all white owned homes. And where I live in Durham, North Carolina, there's a neighborhood where when we started doing the research on it, folks started buying up property in the 1950s and 60s, and those same families, affiliated families, still own all like Black neighborhoods, and people are like, oh, it looks terrible. That's not Black people's stuff to fix up. There's other people neglecting it. And so when those neighborhoods flip over so quickly, it's in part not because people aren't appreciating where they're from or not working hard or caring, but really the systematic barriers that folks have suffered. So it's a project that one of my graduate students is working on, and the chapter that I want to do differently than her, of course, because that's her work. And she's my little activist grad student. But it's something that I think we should think about. And there's a way in which we don't value where poor people and working people live. And we should.
I mean, I think a lot about Weeksville, listening to you say that, right? And I don't know that I thought as much about land until I got this job. And perhaps I'm from Memphis, so Memphis is home to me. All these places, y'all know Mississippi, y'all are like, yes, familiar with all this. I was born in New Orleans. My mom grew up in New Orleans, so that's where half my family is too. So a lot of what you've been saying about Katrina resonated, but this idea around land ownership, right? What that means for folks, and historically in Weeksville, right? The Weeksville experiment, if you want to call it that, right? Very intentional, but the reason that people sort of founded this community was partly about like us having our own and being self-sufficient, but also owning land at that time, if you were a Black man, meant that you could vote. Right? So property meant you got enfranchisement. So Weeksville was an intentional community in that way. Come, buy your land, own a home in Weeksville, bring your family here, but also now you can vote. So now look at all of us Black folks together in the room, right, who all have these shared values and ideas about how we want the world to be for us, how we envision it, how we want the world to look in our communities. Look, now we can do that together, collectively. You talk about collectivity and community in such beautiful ways. Like, every moment in the book comes back to that. And I think, like, I had a question for you about, like, what that looks like, what collective action and community looks like in the present, that maybe it might be too big of a thing to answer, but it's something that's like, that's gonna be playing in my head for a while, right? Like, what does that look like in 2023? And the ways that, like, our ancestors were literally able to not only survive, in some ways thrive, right? Because they leaned on each other and they had each other to look out for, and to make that happen. And I think
we have to keep valuing the spaces where we are. I think we have to keep building as many institutions as we can, and we have to maintain the institutions we already have. And you know, I talk about community so much in the book. I wore the word out. I was like, is there some other way I can describe this? But for me, our ability to communicate, to build alliances, is dramatically different than our ancestors. In certain ways, we're alienated from each other in really key ways. But then we have some tools that bring us really close together in terms of social media and building networks. And so actualizing how we can use the technologies to empower real life institution building might be how I would think about it. But you're always in trouble when you ask a historian, like, what you're supposed to do in the present.
If you could talk more about just how the Black working class, from the original kidnapping and displacement, has always been on the front lines of the Black freedom liberation struggle. But a lot of times when it comes to the class divide, the talent and the tenth, the celebrity aspect, there are these figures that are always lifted up, but we forget the majority that actually sacrificed, that didn't have enough, but they sacrificed everything for the majority.
Yeah, I think, you know, we historians have privileged, and it's something you've said a bunch of times, and I don't think it's come up in conversations necessarily. I think Martha Jones brought it up. That we've sort of talked a lot about the more elite. My mother would say elite. She went to Howard, so in the 50s, so she was like going through. As a little working class person who went there into the heart of, you know, something that, yeah, so many, and she told me all of them. And so we have more stuff from them, right? They were able to write their stories, they were able to voice what they were going through. We can look at their documents and their papers, and so we spent a lot of time looking at their stuff and their papers and the things that they did, which I think are important. But like you said, we haven't had the physical stuff of everyday people. And when you ask folks like my grandparents or your grandparents, were they history makers? They'd be like, oh no. You know, they would wave off the idea because history was this thing that happened outside of us. So for me, it is a retraining of our gaze to look at everyday people, common folks, folks doing regular, real, everyday jobs. Like I love to say, regular, daily. That's where history's lying too. And history's in all of those folks as well. And so those experiences have to now be lifted up. We have to gather them, we have to keep them, we have to continue to teach about them. So for me, that's been the joy and the passion of getting to talk about Black folk, is that these are just my folks. My folks were regular. Like they weren't even as interesting as your folks in terms of like a civil rights narrative, right? They never, crafted a movement in their town, but they're still history. And so I love the way in which it's reminding us of the history in all of us and in all our ancestors.
I had still a running joke with some of my friends who went to Duke, and I was like, so I'm from Memphis, right? From Memphis, born in New Orleans, regular folk, right? And I got to Duke, and I was like, oh, these different kind of Black people. I didn't know.
I'm a grad student, so
listen, everyone was hyphen, or just, it was a whole, like, Memphis is very Black.
And I went to UVA undergrad, so I was like, oh, no. in the middle of the town to 10th. I didn't know. The children of the town 10th were just all up through there.
And it was we got a lot of immigrant folks, a lot of folks from first generation, all of that. And I was like, everybody, and yes, be proud of where you're from, fly your flags, all of that. It's not a shade at all, right? But I was like, damn, I'm just regular black. Joe was like, no, just regular black over here. No hyphens, no flag or country to throw up. I'm Southern country.
The only thing that I was teased, I was like, I'm 4th generation deaconess. That's what I'm 4th generation. They didn't go to college, they didn't do all that stuff, but they were deaconess.
That was one of the first things I thought. Black folk. I also love the title, if I didn't say that already. I love the title so much for its simplicity, but also it says so much in just those 2 words.
My favorite thing was I was in New Orleans for my book event there, and I was walking through the hotel, and a gentleman was like, there's a shorter door to get to the elevator and get downstairs. And so I was like, okay, come on, show me. And he said, what you got in your hand there? I was like, I wrote a book. And he's like, you did, girl, that's good. He said, what's it called? I said, Black Folk. He said, oh. I said, I need that book. And so for me, my editor, he said, there was a guy in the mailroom who saw Black Folk, and because my press is right upstairs, and downstairs is not. And he said it was the first time somebody from the mailroom said, I want to read the book you edited. Because I wanted it to punch through. I didn't want it to be like some title that people wouldn't understand. I wanted it to be how we spoke about ourselves, punching through to everyday folk. And everyday folk can read the book. It's not unreadable, it's not theoretical, it's not. And it irritates some people that it's not theoretical, right? They want to hear the stuff that makes it harder. But it is theoretical, right?
Yes.
So like I'm talking about racial capitalism, I'm talking about gentrification, I'm talking about land loss, I'm talking about all, sort of academic questions.
Social justice movements.
Yeah, but I'm talking about it in ways that are delineated by regular people and can be read and understood. My goal is that my grandmother could have sat and read my book and enjoyed it and seen herself and be like, girl, let me add something else.
It's funny, and I'm not even just saying it just because you're here, but as I think about the themes in the book and all of that, I've been itching to find something in the book club here anyway. And I was going to start with Tony because I just love Tony. And I said I was going to start with my favorite, which is Sula, and just wanted to say that. But hearing...
Sula beloved are at the top. Sula and beloved are.
Yes. I like jazz too. Jazz don't get enough love. Listening to y'all share, and yes, I know there are a couple more questions. I promise I'm going to get them in. We might not have a whole lot of time for Blair to be signing on after, but I like this conversation. We're going to keep it going. But even listening to y'all share your stories, right? It's like the power of the moment that's happening in this room, right? I'm just like, my cheeks hurt from smiling, listening to y'all talk about your people and where you come, connecting the dots, listening to how your story is your story is your story. It was my grandma, that was my great grandma, and it's just really like, we don't have enough of these moments as Black folks, right, together. So I'm really thinking this might be a real good one to kick off a little Weeksville book club. But I'll get you, hopefully we can get you to zoom in or something and figure out what that looks like. But I think this might be my one.
Florida's sort of conversation of like changing the standards is sort of emphasized that slavery was a benefit. It's missing the 2 parts, right? Both that enslaved people came with skills. They were purchased specifically because they knew things that their enslavers did not. And so where my folks are from in South Carolina, they were rice growers in West Africa. So they were brought specifically to cultivate rice and create some of the wealthiest Americans, colonies, and the wealthiest plantation owners, the largest, most vast plantations, before the nation was founded. And so, yes, we were skilled, but it wasn't like a jobs program. It was a wealth-building program for the nation.
Okay.
The other piece is that as soon as those folks are free, they are not empowered to follow those things. So my 3 times great-grandfather Henry is never a blacksmith as a free man, right? So he knows how to do that. He's valued that way. As an enslaved man, as a free man, that's a threat. and those jobs suddenly went to white men. That whole side of my family are skilled carpenters, masons, iron workers, all kinds of that. They never could get jobs. They tried, north or south, could not get jobs. They fought to join unions. They fought to find employment. They built their own homes. Those homes still stand today. But they couldn't get employment in those areas. And so the de-skilling, as Du Bois says, of black workers after the emancipation is also profound. So it's just, it's stupid. They don't know anything, and they're just making stuff up to irritate us and to distract us. We educate our own children. We always have, and we always will. Everything that I learned about my folks' history did not happen in the public school. That textbook said that slaves were the mudsill of society. I remember my mother just walking around the house like seething. Like, mudsill? She was just so mad. But that's what it said about slavery, and then just sort of kept on going. And so, let's train our children to discern the lie when they see it.
What are some words or questions that I can ask the students so they can unlock the joy, the pride in these everyday working jobs? Because that's what they're seeing around here. As we work in the neighborhood and do it, but no one's gonna say, Erica would have that, or oh, they definitely don't want to be me, a teacher. These kinds of things, it's still like a stigma for them.
If they can ask their parents, if they can ask their grandparents, if they can ask great-grandparents, like what it meant to get those jobs and what it took to get those jobs, I think, and what difference those jobs made. Like, so when I think about folks who were postal workers, in the generation before me, that meant like that people could start to purchase homes and do, it was the foundation of so much that future generations could benefit from. It was a legging to a more stable life. And so if you could ask them to, just ask about their family stories, if they have access to them, if they can ask someone in their community who, is older, for this sort of how they came to this neighborhood and what kind of jobs they did. Maybe that would be an interesting way to unlock it. Young people, it's difficult. I just did a talk with a group of HBCU students, and we were talking about the working class, and they were very uncomfortable with the term working class, so much so that they began to tell me that, well, CEOs are working class because they work. They do work, And I was like, so we had to really go back to scratch with it, because we don't talk about it in these terms. We don't think about what difference it made to work an hourly job and then to fight for those benefits and to fight for basic things as part of it. And so it's something that we as a country don't talk about. And so our young people don't have a pathway to really think about it. But I am thinking more about Black folk as curriculum. And my mother was a third grade school teacher, so, it's always in the back of my mind. So thank you.
I'll throw in too, also because I'm biased, I worked at a museum that owned half of the migration series, but obviously Blair's story starts well before the migration officially starts, but there are a lot of images in Jacob Lawrence's migration series that I think would be great to work with students that I'm thinking about differently now after having read the book. And there's one that comes to mind, it's one of my favorites, I think it's panel 59, and it's a washerwoman. And she has a stick and she's stirring, and it's abstract. Wow, that moment really just hit me, and it's a beautiful panel, it's a beautiful series, but those images are really simple. You can even teach math using those, but I think a great entry point in having students sort of visualize and see, because you see people moving, you see people working on the trains and these sort of jobs that are talked about in the book, so I think you maybe also use some of those images to help them bring out their own stories and understand the story of the Black working class.
We know from Caribbean how did we get here, but I always am fascinated by hearing these type of stories, because I always want to know, like, well, how did your family start? When did they start? How did they get, in the past in the United States? So I thank you for this book and continue writing these stories.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
To your question about what my Black folk is, I wrote a little bit, so let me tell you before I ask my question. My Black folk is having no inside voices. It's smelling the fat bat soaking in cabbage with bacon, and my mama put in her secret ingredient that we already know. Ain't no secret. It's throwing the hands up at the man on the side of the street in Thomasville named Booger Shoe, who stayed at the corner. No, we gonna come back and give him a beer and my mama's southern cooking. It's taking my siblings to church even if my mama didn't go, because somebody in this house is gonna catch the Holy Ghost, okay, and bring it back to the rest of them. It's riding around Thomasville past the old furniture plants with my grandfather in his truck that's making the same knocking noise it's been making since I was 11. It's us in the truck as the sun sets, and it's him stopping at McDonald's to get my favorite meal, them French fries and apples. So it's just a little bit for me. But my question for you, to the point of Black excellence and just the different definitions of what success is, during this creative process of writing this book, what would you describe as far as your view of how this book has impacted you? But most important, not importantly, but I really want to understand just your idea of success now that this book has been written. And has it changed or contributed to your definition of what generational love means to you?
Okay. I am very thankful for the journey of this book. And for me, it is much bigger than me. Like, my little old me could not have really put this together without all the ancestral power around me, without the training. There are things in this book that I shouldn't know. There are things that I shouldn't have been able to figure out or see. There are persistent pieces that have been following me. There's a book I collected as a graduate student called by Bishop Hurd, called From Slavery to the Bishopric. And I collected it as a collection called Black Voices, because I looked around the library and there was stuff on the shelves that were written by former slaves, that were their autobiographies that were just circulating. And I was like, they should be in special collections. These are valuable. We can't put them back. These are oftentimes the only editions that you could find. And I purchased some more. And one of the ones I pulled was that book. I used that book in Right to Ride because he fought back on the trains. And then when I was looking and I figured out where my folks were from Elbert County, I was like, well, I need to find an account of Elbert County. Bishop Hurd was enslaved about 3 miles away from where Henry was. So that book has been chasing me my whole life. And so there are certain things that remind you of the sort of ancestral excellence that I think can be brought to bear for this conversation. And so none of it makes me feel like, oh yeah, I did that, or it's been cool and amazing for me to go from I teach history, I talk, I taught classes and wrote books and wrote articles, and most people didn't even really care. And so writing in this way and on this stage and for this press has put me in a different conversation, but I'm still me. And I'm still the person who was raised by my parents and my grandparents. And so I'm not worried about, flossing on anybody with this book. This book is really a gift that I get to give. And it's already done all the things that it could do for me. Like, this room is the gift.
How many Black people are actually in jail, and how many?
Too many.
Mm-hmm. Too many. But what is the percentage? I mean, isn't there more Black working class than there is people in jail?
For me, I do think it's thinking about the intersections of how Blackness has been criminalized, the prison industrial complex, how it has been built up over time, particularly since the 1980s in such a dramatic way, is something that we have to think about. It, like gentrification, is this sort of invisible, insidious thing that is happening without most of us seeing it until we run into the circumstances that amplify it. When we hear a really horrible story or some death really pops out to show us like how insidious and awful it really is. But most of the time it's happening quite silently. And it's happening to people like my ancestors. You know, like if my grandfather and his brother, they were hobos. Like during the Great Depression, they would hop trains and ride them to different places and try to find places to work. None of that's legal. They were good at it. Like, you know, my grandfather from Acclaimed County was a pool shark. He was real good at that. And he got his property, his first property, off a pool gambling game, right? So, yeah, my family's in that too. And the ways in which the 1980s and 90s accelerated a process by which folks who are forced to live outside of the bounds of society are suddenly caught up in a system that churns them over and over and over again as slaves once again is a really profound one. So it does intersect. And I'm probably not smart enough to make it intersect in this answer, but I don't think of myself as not adjacent to that world. I have family who are locked up. I have folks who have been in federal prison who are in my family, and I don't see myself as separate from that. And I don't want to be separate from that either, because that too is my fight.
Thank you for that. Well, I've kept y'all a long time. Yes. Thank y'all for this conversation. My mama texted me and said, tell them what your black folks is. See, she laughing. She didn't know I was gonna call her out like that. My black folks is calling each other out. My black folks is thick skin, jokes, all the jokes. Please, you better be ready. One of my high school friends said, he knows, you show up to my house, be ready for the jokes, because they coming on you. My black folks is rice, not mashed potatoes, because we're from New Orleans. My black folks is my grandma with her big gumbo pot in the kitchen and us all waiting around and her saying, you better not go in my pot and put that ladle back in that water. When you dip it, don't be double dipping. My black folks is also barbecue, because we're Memphis, right? My black folks is strong black women. Even with men in the picture, my black folks is women who made a way out of no way, regular working folks. My folks own a restaurant, so when it comes to like regular working class people, that's my whole family. We all up in there. I grew up in the restaurant, and so that's why I was like, I love this book so much, and it just felt like a gift, and it is a gift, and it is. I hope that everybody who reads it gets this renewed sense of pride in who we are, where we come from, right, and sort of not feeling bad about slavery or the legacy in which we didn't ask for that, right? We didn't ask to be brought here, but we were here and we made a way through that. We're still making a way, even with the barriers still coming. Affirmative action and Florida period, Texas period, right? All the things that are happening, we're still somehow finding a way. And that's not just the talented 10th, right? It's regular folks. It's us here right now having these conversations, pushing this forward. So thank y'all black folks for showing, and non-black folks as well, thank y'all for showing us. We are inclusive here at Weeksville, but blackness is the center, always. So thank y'all for being here and sharing. Yeah, I'm gonna talk to you more about book clubs. Okay. Good evening, y'all. Thank you for coming to Weeksville. I hope I'll see y'all again soon for another program.
Be a part of the conversation. Comment below. And please subscribe to my channel for future videos on New York City and hit the notification bell to receive more updates.